I couldn't sleep knowing what happened at Black Hollow Farm would forever change my life. This is a horror story about Thomas Miller, a young farmer who inherited a cursed property in rural Iowa during the winter of 1964, where ancient evil awakened to claim new victims. Cursed inheritance. Thomas had moved to the isolated farm after his uncle's mysterious death, believing he could start fresh and build a new life. The sprawling acres of cornfields stretched endlessly under grey December skies, while the old farmhouse creaked with memories of generations past. Strange occurrences began immediately. Livestock found mutilated without explanation, whispers echoing from empty rooms, and shadows moving where no one stood. The local townspeople avoided the property, crossing themselves when they passed the rusted iron gates that marked the entrance to what they called the Devil's Own land. Thomas dismissed their superstitions as rural ignorance, but soon discovered that some places hold darkness so deep that it seeps into your very soul. The farm demanded a price for those who dared to call a home, and Thomas would learn that his uncle's death was merely the latest in a long line of sacrifices to something ancient and hungry. If you like real horror stories, leave your like on this video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss anything. The bitter Iowa wind cut through my jacket as I stood before the weathered farmhouse that would be my new home. December 1964 had brought an early winter, and snow already dusted the barren corn fields that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The house itself looked like something from a Gothic novel. 3 stories of dark wood and broken shutters, with a wraparound porch that sagged under the weight of decades. Paint peeled from the siding in long, curling strips, and several windows were boarded up with planks that had turned black with age. Winter 1964. Uncle Harold's death 3 months earlier had been sudden and unexplained. The local sheriff found him in the barn, apparently having suffered a heart attack, though Harold was only 52 and had always been in excellent health. The coroner noted strange scratches on his arms and chest, but attributed them to farm work. I inherited everything: the house, the 200 acres of farmland, the livestock, and all the debts that came with it. Moving here from Chicago seemed like the perfect opportunity to escape my own failures and start over. The real estate agent had been eager to close the deal, practically throwing the keys at me before hurrying back to his car. Now, standing in the dying light of afternoon, I understood his haste. There was something oppressive about this place, something that made my skin crawl and my heart race for no apparent reason. The bare trees surrounding the property swayed in the wind, their branches reaching toward the house like gnarled fingers. What do you think was the real reason Thomas's uncle died? Leave your comment below. The interior of the farmhouse felt even more unsettling than its exterior appearance suggested. Dust motes danced in the pale shafts of light that filtered through grimy windows, and every step across the hardwood floors produced an ominous creak that seemed to echo through the entire structure. The wallpaper in the front parlor had faded to an indeterminate color somewhere between brown and yellow, with a pattern that might once have been roses but now looked more like bloodstains. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece above a stone fireplace, their subjects staring out with eyes that seemed to follow my movement across the room. Uncle Harold appeared in many of the pictures, growing progressively older and more haggard in each successive image, until the final photograph showed a man I barely recognized, gaunt, hollow-eyed, with deep lines etched into his face that spoke of years of fear and sleepless nights. The smell that permeated the house was unlike anything I had ever encountered before. It wasn't simply the mustiness of abandonment or the dampness of old wood. There was something organic and putrid underneath, like meat left to rot in summer heat. I checked every room for the source but found nothing obvious. The kitchen contained the usual appliances, all at least 20 years old, and the pantry held canned goods that had expired during the Eisenhower administration. Upstairs, the bedrooms were sparse and cold, with thin mattresses on iron bed frames and wardrobes that stood like silent sentinels in the corners. Tell me what city and country you're watching from. I'm curious where my viewers are located. As evening approached, I began to understand why the locals whispered about Black Hollow Farm with such obvious fear and revulsion. The very air seemed to grow thicker as darkness fell, pressing against my chest like an invisible weight that made each breath a conscious effort. Outside, the wind had picked up, howling through the gaps in the farmhouse's aging frame and causing the shutters to bang against the walls in an irregular rhythm that sounded almost like Morse code. I had brought only the essentials from Chicago: a few changes of clothes, some books, and my grandfather's hunting rifle, which now leaned against the wall beside the front door. The electricity worked sporadically, with lights flickering on and off without warning, casting dancing shadows that transformed familiar objects into grotesque shapes. I tried to rationalize my growing unease as simple adjustment anxiety, the natural response of a city dweller thrust into rural isolation. But there was something more fundamental at work here, something that operated on a level deeper than conscious thought. My body knew this place was wrong, even if my mind refused to accept such an irrational conclusion. The photographs on the mantelpiece seemed to watch my every move with increasing intensity, and more than once I found myself turning quickly to catch them in the act, only to see the same static images staring back at me. Sleep would be impossible tonight, I realized, as the house settled around me with sounds that went far beyond the normal creaking of old wood and shifting foundations. The first direct encounter with whatever haunted Black Hollow Farm came at precisely 3 in the morning, when I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps pacing back and forth across the floor directly above my makeshift bed in the parlor. The steps were deliberate and heavy, as if someone was wearing work boots, and they followed the same pattern repeatedly. 10 paces from one end of the room to the other, a pause, then 10 paces back. I lay perfectly still, listening to the rhythmic creaking of floorboards overhead, my heart hammering against my ribs with such force that I was certain it would burst. The rational explanation was simple enough. Old houses made noise, thermal expansion caused wood to shift, and my imagination was filling in the gaps. But when I finally summoned the courage to investigate, climbing the narrow staircase with my grandfather's rifle clutched in trembling hands, I found the upstairs hallway completely empty. The dust on the floor showed no disturbance whatsoever, no footprints or scuff marks to indicate recent passage. Yet as I stood there in the weak beam of my flashlight, the pacing resumed directly over my head on the 3rd floor. 3 a.m. I had not yet ventured to the uppermost level of the house, having been told by the real estate agent that the stairs were unsafe and the rooms were used only for storage. Now, with the sound of phantom footsteps echoing from above, I knew that my exploration of the farmhouse was far from complete. The wooden steps groaned ominously under my weight as I climbed toward the source of the disturbance, each creak seeming to announce my presence to whatever waited in the darkness above. The 3rd floor of the farmhouse existed in a state of decay that went far beyond simple neglect, as if time itself moved differently in that elevated realm of shadows and silence. The air was noticeably colder than the floors below, and my breath formed visible clouds in the beam of my flashlight as I emerged into a narrow hallway lined with doors that hung askew on their hinges. The smell I had noticed throughout the house was much stronger here, almost overwhelming in its intensity, like a combination of rotting vegetation and something far more sinister. Most of the doors were locked, their old-fashioned skeleton keys long since lost, but one at the end of the hall stood slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent energy. My rational mind screamed warnings about structural integrity and personal safety, but something deeper compelled me forward, as if I was being drawn by invisible strings toward whatever waited beyond that partially open door. The floorboards felt spongy and unreliable beneath my feet, and more than once I was certain they would give way and send me crashing through to the level below. When I finally reached the door and pushed it open with the barrel of my rifle, the hinges shrieked like a wounded animal, and the smell that wafted out was so powerful that I doubled over, retching and gasping for clean air. Inside the room, my flashlight beam revealed something that would haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. The walls were covered with what appeared to be symbols carved directly into the wood, strange geometric patterns and twisted figures that seemed to writhe and shift in the dancing light. My Uncle Harold had clearly spent considerable time in that horrible room on the 3rd floor, as evidenced by the makeshift desk fashioned from old crates and the hundreds of journal pages scattered across its surface like fallen leaves. The writing was in Harold's familiar handwriting, though it became increasingly erratic and illegible as the entries progressed through the months leading up to his death. The earliest pages described normal farming activities, crop rotations, livestock care, equipment maintenance, but gradually shifted focus to document strange occurrences around the property. Harold wrote about animals behaving strangely, refusing to enter certain areas of the farm and making sounds he had never heard before. He documented temperature drops that occurred without weather-related explanations, finding rooms in the house that were 20 degrees colder than others with no apparent cause. As I read deeper into his journals, crouched on the floor of that cursed room with my flashlight growing steadily dimmer, I discovered that Harold had become obsessed with the history of Black Hollow Farm and the families who had owned it before our lineage acquired the property. According to his research, conducted through newspaper archives and local historical societies, every previous owner had died under mysterious circumstances. Suicides, accidents, unexplained illnesses that consumed their victims from within. The farm had been built in 1847 on land that local Native American tribes had considered sacred, a place where the barrier between worlds grew thin and things that should remain hidden could slip through into our reality. Harold's final entry spoke of dreams where he was called to perform some unspecified ritual, compelled by voices that whispered to him from the walls themselves. The breaking point came when I realized that the symbols carved into the walls of Harold's secret room were not random marks of madness, but rather a carefully constructed pattern that formed a larger design when viewed from the proper perspective. Standing in the center of the room and slowly rotating, I could see how each individual carving connected to others, creating an intricate mandala of occult significance that covered every surface from floor to ceiling. The symbols seemed to move in my peripheral vision, rearranging themselves into new configurations when I wasn't looking directly at them, though whenever I turned my head they snapped back into their original positions. Harold's journals contained rough sketches of these same symbols, along with notations indicating he had copied them from somewhere else in the house, somewhere I had not yet discovered. The weight of generations of accumulated evil pressed down on me in that room, making it difficult to think clearly or maintain any sense of rational perspective. I understood now why Harold had looked so haggard in his final photographs, why the townspeople crossed themselves when they spoke of Black Hollow Farm, why every previous owner had met an untimely end. The farm was not simply haunted, it was actively malevolent, a focal point for something ancient and hungry that fed on human suffering and despair. My decision to stay and fight this presence, rather than flee immediately back to Chicago, was made in that moment of clarity, though I would later question the wisdom of such bravado when faced with the true scope of the evil that called this place home. The consequences of my decision became apparent almost immediately, as the malevolent presence that had been merely observing my activities suddenly shifted into a more active and aggressive phase. The temperature in the house dropped so dramatically that ice began forming on the inside surfaces of windows, and my breath came out in thick white plumes that seemed to hang in the air longer than physically possible. Every sound became amplified and distorted. The creaking of floorboards thundered like artillery fire, the wind outside howled with voices that formed almost recognizable words, and the pipes in the walls clanged with a rhythm that matched my racing heartbeat. Sleep became impossible as the pacing footsteps overhead resumed nightly, joined by other sounds that defied easy categorization. Sometimes I heard what sounded like furniture being dragged across floors, sometimes like children crying in distant rooms, and occasionally like animals scratching desperately at the walls from inside the house itself. The photographs on the mantelpiece had definitely changed. The faces in them now wore expressions of barely contained terror, and new figures appeared in the backgrounds of pictures that I was certain had been empty before. Food spoiled within hours of being brought into the house, developing patches of mold that formed patterns suspiciously similar to the symbols carved in Harold's room. December nights, the livestock grew increasingly agitated, refusing to approach the farmhouse and huddling together at the far end of their enclosures, their eyes wide with an animal fear that seemed to peer directly into dimensions beyond human perception. I found myself talking aloud to combat the oppressive silence, but my voice sounded strange and hollow in the tainted air, as if the house itself was absorbing the sound and transforming it into something unrecognizable. The supernatural events escalated beyond mere atmospheric disturbances when I began experiencing direct physical manifestations of the presence that inhabited Black Hollow Farm. Objects moved on their own with increasing frequency and boldness. Kitchen utensils rearranged themselves into ritual patterns while I slept. Books flew off shelves and opened to specific pages containing references to ancient sacrificial practices, and doors slammed shut with such force that the entire house shook on its foundation. The most terrifying incidents involved what I can only describe as invisible hands that would grab at my clothing, push against my back when I climbed stairs, and leave scratches on my arms that appeared without any memory of how I received them. These scratches formed patterns identical to some of the symbols in Harold's room, as if something was marking me with occult significance that I couldn't begin to comprehend. The mirrors in the house showed reflections that didn't quite match my movements, subtle delays and variations that suggested someone or something else was puppeting my image. Sometimes I caught glimpses of other figures standing behind me in the reflections, shadowy forms with eyes that burned like coals in the darkness. The house itself seemed to be alive and breathing, with walls that expanded and contracted rhythmically and floors that felt warm and pulse-like beneath my feet. Windows that I distinctly remembered boarding up would be found open the next morning, their boards lying in neat piles as if removed by careful hands rather than torn away by force. The very architecture of the farmhouse appeared to be changing, with rooms that seemed larger or smaller than before, and hallways that led to destinations different from where I expected them to end. The descent into complete psychological terror began when I discovered that the presence haunting Black Hollow Farm could manipulate not just physical objects but also my own memories and perceptions of reality. I would find myself in rooms with no recollection of how I had arrived there, holding objects that I had never seen before, engaged in activities that made no rational sense. Sometimes I would wake up to discover that I had been carving symbols into the walls of the house, using tools that appeared in my hands without explanation and disappeared just as mysteriously when the work was complete. My reflection in mirrors began showing me performing actions that I was not consciously choosing to make, speaking words I could not hear, making gestures I did not recognize, writing in journals that vanished before I could read what I had written. Time itself became unreliable within the confines of the farmhouse, with hours passing in what felt like minutes and minutes stretching into eternities of psychological torment. I would begin reading Harold's journals in what I believed was early evening, only to discover that dawn was breaking outside windows that should have shown midnight darkness. The distinction between sleeping and waking consciousness blurred until I could no longer be certain which state I was in at any given moment. Dreams and reality merged into a continuous nightmare where the rules of physics and logic held no meaning. The presence was learning to inhabit my mind directly, showing me visions of the farm's history that felt more real than my own memories. Images of previous owners performing unspeakable rituals in the basement, of Native American shamans warning against disturbing the sacred ground, of something vast and hungry stirring beneath the foundations, waiting for the right combination of circumstances to break free from its ancient prison. The moment of greatest terror arrived when I finally understood the true nature of what haunted Black Hollow Farm and my role in its centuries-long plan. The presence was not merely some restless spirit or demonic entity seeking to frighten away unwanted visitors. It was something far older and more terrible, a primordial force that had been using the farm as an anchor point in our reality since before human civilization began. Every family that had owned the property, every mysterious death and disappearance, had been part of a larger ritual spanning generations, with each tragedy feeding power into something that grew stronger and more substantial with every sacrifice. Harold had discovered this truth in his final weeks, and his journals contained detailed descriptions of visions showing the entity's ultimate goal: to accumulate enough spiritual energy to manifest fully in our world and spread its influence across the entire region. The symbols carved throughout the house were not just decorative elements but rather components of a vast summoning circle, with the farmhouse itself serving as the central focal point. I was not a random inheritor who had stumbled into this situation by chance. My bloodline had been specifically chosen centuries ago, bred and guided through generations to produce the perfect final sacrifice at the predetermined moment. The scratches appearing on my arms were not random markings but rather the beginning stages of a transformation process that would prepare my body to serve as a permanent vessel for the ancient entity. As this horrible revelation sank into my consciousness, I felt the presence pressing more insistently against the barriers of my mind, eager to complete the process that had been building toward this moment for longer than recorded history could document. The devastating consequences of this revelation shattered what remained of my sanity and left me trapped in a farmhouse that had become a living nightmare beyond human comprehension. Every surface I touched burned like ice against my skin, every breath I drew felt thick and poisonous, and every sound echoed with otherworldly harmonics that seemed designed to drive listeners to madness. The entity's presence filled every corner of my consciousness, showing me visions of what the world would become after its emergence. Vast cities consumed by shadows that moved with malevolent intelligence, humans reduced to mindless servants performing endless rituals, and reality itself reshaped according to geometries that violated natural law. My body was no longer entirely under my own control, with my hands moving independently to carve new symbols into walls and furniture, my voice speaking words and languages that predated human speech, and my feet carrying me to parts of the farmhouse that I had never seen before but that felt intimately familiar. The basement, which I had assumed was simply a foundation crawlspace, revealed itself to be a vast underground chamber filled with altars made from human bones and pools of liquid that reflected no light whatsoever. Harold had spent his final days down there, preparing the space according to instructions whispered by voices only he could hear, building toward a culmination that would transform Black Hollow Farm into a permanent gateway between dimensions. The walls were covered with symbols identical to those upstairs, but carved much deeper and filled with a substance that looked disturbingly like dried blood. Ancient ritual. In the center of the chamber stood a circular platform raised several feet above the surrounding floor, its surface inscribed with patterns that hurt to look at directly and seemed to shift and writhe when observed peripherally. My desperate attempt to break free from the entity's influence led me to make the catastrophic decision to destroy the symbols that served as its anchor points in our reality. Using gasoline from the farm storage shed, I doused every carved surface I could find, believing that fire might cleanse the house of its supernatural contamination and sever the connection that allowed the presence to maintain its hold on the property. The flame spread with supernatural speed and intensity, consuming the wooden walls with an eagerness that suggested the fire itself had been corrupted by the entity's influence. Instead of weakening the presence, however, the destruction of the symbols seemed to release energies that had been carefully contained and channeled for centuries, causing reality itself to become unstable within the boundaries of Black Hollow Farm. The air shimmered like heat waves rising from summer pavement, but these distortions revealed glimpses of other places and times. the farm as it had existed in different decades, populated by the ghosts of previous owners who continued their daily routines unaware that they had died years or decades ago. The burned symbols reappeared on new surfaces almost immediately, carved by invisible hands that worked within human speed and precision. Windows showed views of landscapes that existed nowhere on Earth, with skies the color of old blood and vegetation that moved without wind. The unexpected plot twist came when I realized that the fire had not been my own idea at all, but rather another manipulation by the entity, which had needed the symbols destroyed in precisely this manner to complete the final phase of its emergence ritual. The deepening horror that followed this realization revealed new layers of the entity's deception that stretched back through my entire life, not just the week since I had arrived at Black Hollow Farm. Every major decision I had ever made, every relationship that had shaped my development, every failure and success that had led me to this moment, had been carefully orchestrated by an intelligence that operated on timescales beyond human comprehension. My Uncle Harold had not simply inherited the farm, he had been selected as the previous generation's sacrifice, kept alive just long enough to prepare the way for my arrival and to complete specific ritual preparations that required blood connection to the original summoning. The woman I had dated in Chicago, whose sudden departure had contributed to my decision to leave the city, had been an agent of the entity, planted in my life to ensure I would be emotionally vulnerable and geographically mobile when the call came to claim my inheritance. My grandfather's hunting rifle, which I had brought for protection, was itself a ritual object that had been used in previous ceremonies, its metal infused with the spiritual residue of generations of sacrifices. The very concept of inheriting the farm had been an illusion. I had not received ownership of the property so much as I had been delivered to it like a package to its intended destination. My psychology reached its absolute limits as I understood that my entire existence had been nothing more than an elaborate breeding and conditioning program, designed to produce a human being with exactly the right combination of bloodline, psychological profile, and spiritual susceptibility to serve the entity's needs. Free will had been an illusion maintained just long enough to ensure my compliance with the predetermined plan. The escalation toward the story's climax began with the systematic dissolution of the boundary between the farmhouse and the otherworldly realm from which the entity originated. Walls became translucent, revealing vast spaces filled with architecture that followed no earthly logic, corridors that extended infinitely in all directions, staircases that climbed toward ceilings that disappeared into star-filled darkness, and rooms populated by figures that might once have been human but had been transformed into something altogether different. The temperature fluctuations became so extreme that ice and fire existed simultaneously in the same spaces, with frost-covered surfaces radiating heat that should have melted them instantly. Gravity worked inconsistently throughout the house, with objects falling upward in some rooms while others experienced crushing pressure that made movement nearly impossible. The entity's voice became clearly audible for the first time, speaking directly into my consciousness in a language that bypassed my ears entirely and resonated through my bones and nervous system. It spoke of eons spent in exile from a universe where it had once reigned supreme, of the careful patience required to establish footholds in new realities, and of the satisfaction it would experience when Black Hollow Farm became the beachhead for a full-scale invasion of our dimensional plane. The ritual preparation that had consumed generations of my bloodline was nearing completion, requiring only my willing participation in the final ceremony to tear open a permanent gateway between worlds. My preparation for the definitive confrontation involved gathering the few tools that might still retain some power to resist the entity's influence: salt from the kitchen, which had traditionally been used for protection against supernatural forces, iron nails from the barn that might disrupt otherworldly energies, and Harold's journals, which contained research into potential countermeasures that previous owners had attempted. The final confrontation took place in the basement chamber where Harold had prepared the summoning circle, with reality bending and warping around us as two incompatible forms of existence struggled for dominance over the same physical space. The entity manifested in a form that my human senses could barely process, a shifting amalgamation of shadows and geometries that seemed to exist in more dimensions than I could perceive, with appendages that reached through space in ways that violated every law of physics I had ever understood. Its voice filled the chamber with harmonics that made the stone walls vibrate and crack, speaking words that carried meaning beyond language and painted images directly onto my consciousness. The ritual circle blazed with light that cast no shadows, while the pools of dark liquid reflected scenes from dozens of different realities where similar ceremonies had successfully opened gateways for the entity's emergence. My resistance to the summoning process caused feedback loops in the magical energies that had been carefully balanced for centuries, creating explosions of raw power that tore holes in the fabric of space itself. Through these rifts, I could see glimpses of the entity's home dimension, a realm of eternal darkness populated by beings of such malevolent intelligence that human minds were not equipped to comprehend their existence. The maximum narrative intensity of our struggle came when I realized that the only way to prevent the entity's emergence was to disrupt the ritual by destroying myself, thereby breaking the bloodline connection that served as its anchor point in our reality. The iron nails and salt had proven useless against something that existed primarily in dimensions beyond physical matter, but my own death might sever the spiritual link that had been forged through generations of careful breeding and conditioning. The immediate consequences of my attempted sacrifice revealed the final, most horrifying aspect of the entity's plan. My death would not prevent the ritual's completion, but rather provide the exact catalyst needed to tear open the dimensional barrier permanently. As I drove Harold's hunting knife toward my own heart, the entity's laughter filled the chamber with such force that the stone walls began to crumble, revealing the vast spaces of its home dimension pressing against the boundaries of our reality. The wound I inflicted upon myself began bleeding in patterns that matched the symbols carved throughout the farmhouse, and my blood flowed upward toward the ceiling rather than pooling on the floor, forming intricate designs in the air that blazed with supernatural light. The permanent trauma of understanding that I had been manipulated into providing the final component of my own destruction shattered my mind completely, leaving me conscious but unable to process the reality of my situation in any coherent way. My psychology fractured into fragments, with part of me observing the ritual's completion with detached fascination, while another part screamed in endless terror at the implications of what was about to be unleashed upon the world. The entity began its emergence through the gateway my sacrifice had opened, and reality around Black Hollow Farm transformed to accommodate its presence. Trees twisted into impossible shapes, the sky took on colors that had no names, and the very air became thick with energies that made breathing an exercise in conscious effort. The farmhouse itself began to phase in and out of existence, sometimes appearing as the decaying structure I knew and sometimes revealing itself as a vast temple dedicated to powers that predated human civilization by millions of years. The final resolution of my ordeal came not with victory or escape, but with the terrible understanding that I had become a permanent part of Black Hollow Farm's supernatural ecosystem, forever trapped between life and death in a state of existence that served the entity's ongoing needs. My body had been transformed into a vessel capable of surviving in multiple dimensions simultaneously, allowing me to witness the full scope of the entity's influence as it spread beyond the boundaries of the farm and began affecting the surrounding region. The nearby town of Cedar Falls experienced its first unexplained deaths within days of the ritual's completion, with victims found in states that suggested they had died of pure terror, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute horror. Livestock throughout the county began behaving erratically, and reports of strange lights and sounds emanating from Black Hollow Farm drew investigators who disappeared without explanation. The open gateway in the basement chamber served as a beachhead for increasingly frequent incursions by entities from the other dimension, each one more terrible than the last, and each one carrying out specific tasks in what appeared to be a carefully orchestrated plan to transform our reality into something more suitable for their kind. My consciousness existed in a state of expanded awareness that allowed me to perceive these activities with perfect clarity, while being completely powerless to intervene or warn anyone of the approaching catastrophe. The final state of my existence was one of eternal witness to humanity's gradual subjugation by forces beyond their comprehension, watching helplessly as the world I had once known was slowly consumed by darkness that spread outward from Black Hollow Farm like an infection in the fabric of reality itself. Years have passed since that terrible night in the basement chamber, though time moves differently now in my transformed state, and I can observe the entity's influence spreading across Iowa and beyond like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. The farm appears abandoned to casual observers, but it serves as the central hub for an invasion that operates on scales both vast and intimate, corrupting everything it touches while maintaining the illusion of normalcy for those not yet ready to serve its purposes. I remain here as both guardian and prisoner, my consciousness expanded beyond human limitations but trapped within boundaries defined by powers I can never hope to challenge. The final mental image that will stay with anyone who hears this account should be the terrible understanding that Black Hollow Farm was never an isolated incident, but rather one node in a network of similar sites scattered across the globe, each one preparing for the same emergence, each one fed by generations of carefully orchestrated sacrifices. The permanent implications of the terror I lived through extend far beyond my personal fate, representing the opening moves in a campaign that will eventually encompass all of human civilization, transforming our species into willing servants of entities whose very existence violates the natural order of our universe. The whispers in the walls have spread to other houses now, and the symbols are appearing in new locations, carved by hands that move without conscious direction, preparing the way for the next phase of a plan that spans millennia and treats human lives as nothing more than components in a vast, incomprehensible machine designed to reshape reality itself. If you're ready for more spine-chilling tales like this one, check out our other terrifying stories in the playlist below.